She was 6 years old. She had no shoes on. February in Philadelphia. And this little girl had run 11 blocks through slush and broken glass with nothing on her feet but a pair of her mother's wool socks, soaked through and gone gray with street water. She pushed open a door she had no business pushing open. Inside that door were 19 men, wine on the table, cigar smoke hanging in the light. And at the back of the room, in the seat that faced the door, because he always sat facing the door, was a man that half the city crossed the street to avoid. She walked past all of them, past the ones who could have stopped her, past the ones who reached out and then thought better of it. She walked all the way to the back of that room, and she put both of her small hands on the sleeve of his coat, and she said 7 words. "They're beating my mama. Please, she's dying." Nobody moved, nobody breathed. A fork slid off a plate and hit the tile, and nobody even looked at it, because the man she picked, out of every man in Philadelphia she could have picked, was the last man on earth you would ever go to for mercy. And what he did next, not that night, not in that room, but at 4 o'clock the next morning in a bakery with the windows kicked in, is something the people of Iron Row still argue about 50 years later. Some of them call it justice. Some of them call it something worse. Stay with me all the way to the end of this one, because the last 2 minutes of this story will change how you think about the whole thing. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Tap that like button, because it genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to hear stories like this one. Hit subscribe if you haven't. And down in the comments, tell me what city you're watching from and how cold it is right now, because trust me, the cold matters in this story. All right. Philadelphia, February 1974. There was a restaurant on Christian Street called Balandi's. From the outside, it looked like nothing. Green awning gone black at the seams. A hand-painted sign that hadn't been touched up since Truman was president. If you were a tourist, you'd walk right past it. That was the point. Inside, the ceiling was low and pressed tin, 12 tables, a bar with 6 stools that nobody was ever allowed to sit on, and in the back corner, under a painting of a coastline in Sicily that nobody had ever visited, a round table for 8 that stayed empty 6 nights a week. On Thursdays, it wasn't empty. On Thursdays, that table belonged to Matteo Vitale. He was 61 years old that winter, big hands, reading glasses he refused to wear in front of anyone, a gray overcoat he'd owned since 1961 and had relined twice rather than replace. He did not shout. He did not threaten. Men who had known him 30 years said they had never once heard him raise his voice, and every single one of them said it the same way, quietly, and after checking the room. They called him the Cardinal, not to his face. It started as a joke about the coat and about the way men came to that back table to confess things, and then somewhere along the way, the joke stopped being funny and just became his name. He ran 3 things: the docks at Pier 38, the union locals that fed the docks, and the money that moved between them. He had never been convicted of a violent crime. He had spent 9 years in Holmesburg prison on a conspiracy charge in the 50s, and he had never, in all that time, given anyone a single name. There were rules at Balandi's on Thursday night. You came at 8. You brought your numbers on paper, not in your head. You did not discuss anything that had a body attached to it at the table where food was served. You did not interrupt. And when Matteo Vitale set his glass down on the tablecloth and left his hand flat beside it, the conversation was finished, whether you were finished or not. That February Thursday, the numbers were bad. A shipment out of Baltimore had gone sideways. A judge who used to take calls had stopped taking calls. Bruno Pastore, a heavy-set man everyone called Bear because he had been a fighter and had the ears to prove it, was in the middle of explaining a shortfall of $11,000 when the front door of the restaurant opened. Nobody opened that door on a Thursday. There was a man named Gio Renzi, whose entire job, for 19 years, had been to sit at the small table by the entrance and make sure nobody opened that door on a Thursday. He had a coat folded over his lap and a .38 under the coat, and he had used it exactly twice, both times a long time ago. Gio stood up, and then Gio Renzi, who had thrown a state senator out of that restaurant once for showing up unannounced, stopped where he was and did not move at all, because it was a child. She was so small that at first the men at the far tables didn't see her at all. They just saw the door standing open and the cold coming in and the snow blowing sideways across the floorboards. Then she stepped into the light. Her coat was too big for her. A man's coat, the sleeves rolled and still hanging past her fingers. Her hair was black and wet and stuck to her forehead. There was blood on the front of that coat, and it wasn't hers, and every single man in that room knew, immediately from long and unpleasant experience, that it wasn't hers. Her feet. That was the thing people talked about afterward, not the blood. The feet. She was standing in a puddle of melted snow, in a pair of gray wool socks with holes worn through both heels, and her feet were the color of skim milk, and she was shaking so hard you could hear her teeth. Gio put his hand out toward her, gently. The way you'd approach a bird that got into the house. "Sweetheart," he said. "Sweetheart, you're in the wrong place." She went right past him. She didn't run. That's the detail I keep coming back to. She had run 11 blocks to get there, and now that she was inside, she walked. She walked down the aisle between the tables with her arms wrapped around herself, and she looked at every man she passed, and she kept walking. She passed Sal Cardone, who ran numbers on Washington Avenue and had a daughter her age. She passed a lawyer named Feld, who put his napkin down and looked at the ceiling. She passed 2 young guys from the docks who half stood, then sat, then looked at each other and didn't know what to do with their hands. And she stopped at the round table in the back. Later, years later, when she was grown and someone finally asked her, she said she didn't pick him because of the coat or the ring or the way the room had gone quiet around him. She said she picked him because he was the only man in the whole restaurant who was already looking at her. Everybody else was looking away. Matteo Vitale was looking right at her, and he hadn't stopped since the door opened. She put both hands on his sleeve, small fingers in the wool. She had to reach up to do it. "They're beating my mama," she said. "Please, she's dying." Bear Pastore said the room went so quiet he could hear the icebox motor kick on in the kitchen 40 feet away. Nobody in that room had ever touched Matteo Vitale without being invited to. Not one man at that table would have put a hand on his coat. There was a lieutenant named Enzo Ferro who had worked for him for 22 years and had shaken his hand maybe 6 times. And here was this little girl, holding on to him with both fists, dripping street water onto his shoes. Matteo did not pull away. He looked down at her for what Bear later swore was a full 10 seconds. And in that silence, something happened to his face. Bear had seen that man take news of his own brother's death without a flicker. Bear had watched him sign off on things that would keep a normal person awake for the rest of their life, and then order dessert. He had never seen him look like this. "What's your name?" Matteo asked. Her voice came out in pieces. "Nora." "Nora what?" "Kowalski." And that name landed in the room like a dropped plate, because everybody at that table knew exactly where the Kowalski bakery was. And everybody at that table knew exactly who had been collecting on Iron Row since the fall. Matteo Vitale did something then that nobody who worked for him had ever witnessed. He got out of his chair and he went down on one knee on the floor of that restaurant, in a suit that cost more than most of the men there made in a month, in a puddle of dirty snowmelt, so that his eyes were level with hers. He was a heavy man. It took him a moment. Nobody helped him. "Nora," he said, "I need you to tell me everything, and I need you to tell me fast, and then I'm going to fix it. Can you do that?" She nodded, and then she couldn't talk at all because the crying finally caught up with her. He waited. He didn't shush her, didn't tell her it was okay, didn't do any of the things people do when they want a child to stop crying so the adults can get on with it. He just knelt there on the wet floor and waited, and after maybe half a minute she got a breath in and it came out of her in a rush. 2 men had come to the bakery at closing. They came on the first Thursday of the month always. Her mother called them the rent men. So Nora wouldn't be scared, but Nora was 6, not stupid, and she knew. Her mother didn't have it. She'd had it. And then the boiler in the basement cracked in January, and if the boiler is dead, you can't proof dough. And if you can't proof dough, you can't sell bread. And if you can't sell bread, you don't have $80 on the first Thursday of the month. Nora's mother offered them $31 and a tray of rye. They put her through the front display case. Nora had been upstairs in the apartment above the shop. She was supposed to stay upstairs on the first Thursday. That was the rule. She came down anyway, and she got to the bottom of the stairs in time to see one of them, the one with the burn scar all the way up his wrist, take her mother by the hair. She said her mother screamed at her to run. She said she ran. She said she ran up Iron Row, and she banged on the door of the shoe repair, and the light was on, and nobody came. She banged on the pharmacy. She could see Mr. Adler through the glass. He turned around and walked into the back. She banged on 4 doors on her own street, and not one of them opened. And that, right there, is when this stopped being a story about a robbery. Because a 6-year-old girl learned something on Iron Row that night that most people don't learn until they're 40, if they learn it at all. That fear is a thing that lives in people, and that it makes them into furniture. So, she stopped knocking on doors where the lights were on. She thought about it, the way a child thinks, in pictures instead of sentences. And she remembered a green awning on Christian Street. She remembered her mother pulling her past it once, fast, gripping her hand too hard, and she remembered asking why. And she remembered exactly what her mother said, because her mother had said it in Polish, and she only used Polish when she was frightened. Because in there are the men that the bad men are afraid of. Nora Kowalski was 6 years old, and she did the coldest, clearest piece of arithmetic anyone in that restaurant had ever heard. The men who hurt Mama were bad. The men in that room scared the bad men. Therefore, she told Matteo Vitale all of this on her knees, hiccuping, holding his coat. And when she finished, she said one more thing, and this is the line that Bear Pastore, a man who had done genuinely terrible things for a living, said he had to leave the room after hearing. She said, "I'm sorry I came in without knocking." To understand what happened for the rest of that night, you have to understand a room in Matteo Vitale's house that had been locked since 1959. He had a wife once, Rosa. He met her at a wedding in 1946, where he was a stranger and she was the bride's cousin. And he told a friend on the drive home that he was going to marry that girl, and 8 months later, he did, and they had a daughter, Cecilia, born 1953. Black hair like her mother, and a laugh that was, by all accounts, far too loud for such a small person. In 1955, Matteo went to Holmesburg. Conspiracy. 9 years, out in 7 if he kept his mouth shut, and he kept his mouth shut. He was 38 when the gate closed behind him, and he told Rosa it was nothing. It was paperwork. It was a stretch of bad road. In February of 1959, his daughter got sick. It started as a sore throat. It became rheumatic fever. There was a hospital across the river that could have helped her, and there was a doctor there who could have helped her. And there was, at that time, a 9-day gap between Rosa asking for help and getting it. She wrote to men who owed her husband. Some of them wrote back and some of them didn't. One of them sent $40 in an envelope with no note. Cecilia Vitale died on the 22nd of February, 1959. She was 5 years, 11 months old. They let Matteo out for the funeral in handcuffs and a borrowed suit. 2 guards stood behind him at the grave. He was not permitted to touch the coffin. He went back inside that afternoon. He served 3 more years. Rosa visited twice more and then stopped. And then in 1963 she was gone too. Cancer, fast. And by the time it was found, there was nothing to find it with. When Matteo Vitale walked out of Holmesburg in 1964, he was 51 years old, and there was nobody at the gate. Here's the thing, nobody in that restaurant knew, and that only one man alive knew, and that man was Gio Renzi, who drove him. Every February 22nd, Matteo Vitale drove himself to a cemetery in Yeadon. He didn't bring flowers. He brought bread. Cecilia had liked bread, not cake. She'd throw a fit if you gave her cake. She wanted the heel of a warm loaf with butter, and she wanted it torn, not cut. And she'd eat it sitting on the counter with her feet swinging. So every February, Matteo Vitale bought a loaf of bread and sat in a cemetery in the cold and tore off a piece and left it there, which is a stupid thing to do, and which he did anyway, for 15 years. Nora Kowalski came through that door on February 20th, 2 days short. Her mother owned a bakery. She was 6 years old, and she came to him because nobody else would open the door. "Now, you tell me what you do." He stood up. His knee cracked audibly. He took off his overcoat, the gray one, the one he'd owned since 1961, and he wrapped it around a 6-year-old girl until she disappeared inside it. And he lifted her off the floor and set her on the chair beside his, the chair that belonged to Enzo Ferro, and Enzo Ferro stood up without being asked and stayed standing for the rest of the conversation. Then, Matteo Vitale did what he always did, which is the reason he was still alive at 61 when almost everyone he'd started with was dead. He did things in the correct order, not rage first. Rage is expensive, and it makes you slow. "Gio," he didn't look up. "Get the car warm. Bear, you drive the second car." "Bear," he said, "do you know Iris Novak?" Bear knew. Dr. Iris Novak was a trauma surgeon at Methodist who had gotten herself into a serious problem with a serious man in 1969, and Matteo Vitale had made the problem stop existing and had never once asked her for anything since, which meant, in the arithmetic of that world, that he could ask her for exactly one thing, one time, and it had better be big. Call her at home, tell her it's me, tell her it's a woman, 40 or so, blunt trauma, and tell her where. He turned to Enzo. The bakery on Iron Row, Kowalski's. Who has that block? Enzo Ferro did not want to answer. You could see it in his shoulders, because the answer to that question was going to change the shape of the night. Nobody has it, Enzo said carefully. That block's been open since Cataldo died. There's a crew calling themselves Iron Row. Kids mostly. Deacon Pyle runs them. Pyle. Matteo turned the name over. The one with the church name. He gives money to a church, Enzo said. Keeps a pew, sits in it. Matteo looked at the little girl in his coat. She had gone quiet. She had stopped shaking and gotten very still instead, which is worse, and which anyone who has ever worked in an emergency room will tell you is worse. The men in the shop tonight, he said to her gently. Can you tell me what they looked like? She didn't hesitate. This is a thing about children that adults consistently underestimate. She had spent that entire 11-block run memorizing them because some part of her knew she would be asked. One is skinny and his neck is red. He has a burn on his arm up to here. She touched her own wrist and drew a line to her elbow. The other one is fat and he laughs when he isn't laughing. Nobody in the room understood that last part. Nobody asked. Bear Pastore did, however, write it down. They said names. The fat one said, Quinn, come on, and the skinny one said, shut up, Dutch. Bear stopped writing. He knew both. Ray Quinn, 26, out of Kensington, burn scar from a chip pan when he was 9. Dutch Malloy, 30, gold canine tooth, a laugh like a drain emptying. Matteo set his glass down on the tablecloth and laid his hand flat beside it. The conversation was finished. Bring me both of them, he said. Not tonight. Tomorrow, before dawn. Alive, awake, and able to stand up on their own 2 feet, because they're going to be standing for a long time. Bear said, Boss, if we go tonight, we get them at the bar on Amber Street. I know where they are, Matteo said. I want them to sleep first. 19 men in that restaurant, and not one of them understood what he meant by that. They would. Iron Row wasn't a real street name. It was a 9-block stretch of Ridge Avenue where the row houses had wrought iron on every window, put there in the 20s, kept there in the 70s for entirely different reasons. 2 cars came up it a little after 9 that night with their headlights off. Kowalski's Bakery had a green door and a hand-lettered sign and a display case that had been in that building since 1931. Nora's grandfather bought it with money he made hauling coal. Her father, Tomasz, had died on a scaffold at a construction site on Broad Street in 1970 when Nora was 2.5, and the settlement had been $600, and Anna Kowalski had buried her husband and gone back to work in 11 days, because the ovens don't care what happened to you. The window was in, not broken. In. There was glass on the sidewalk in a wide arc, and there was flour in the glass, a white drift of it blowing across the pavement in the wind, like the world's saddest snow. Matteo Vitale got out of the car. He told Nora to stay with Gio, and she said no. He looked at her for a second, and then he took her hand and he brought her in with him, which about a dozen child psychologists would tell you was the wrong call, and which was, I think, the right one, because that girl was never going to believe anything again that she wasn't allowed to see for herself. Anna Kowalski was behind the counter, on the floor, between the wall and the flour bins. She was 39. She had been in that country for 21 years. She had a broken orbital bone, a broken wrist, 4 broken ribs, and a skull fracture above her left ear, and she had crawled. This is the part that gets me. She had crawled 8 feet across a floor covered in broken glass, dragging herself with one arm, and she had made it behind the counter, not to hide. There was a telephone on the wall behind the counter. It was on a cord. She had pulled the whole thing down, and the receiver was still in her hand. She was trying to call for her daughter. She had been unconscious for something over an hour by the time they found her, and the receiver was still off the hook, and there was a dial tone humming into that empty shop the whole time. Bear Pastore, who was not a good man, went outside and stood in the cold for a while. Dr. Iris Novak arrived 9 minutes later in a station wagon with a surgical kit, and her husband driving. She got on the floor in her coat. She checked pupils, pulse, and airway, and she said one word, now. They carried Anna Kowalski out of her own bakery on a folding table, because there was no time for anything better, and they put her in the back of the station wagon, and Novak went with her, and that car went up Ridge Avenue at 60 miles an hour, with Gio's sedan running interference at every red light. Matteo Vitale stayed behind. He stood in the middle of that wrecked bakery for a long moment. Broken glass, flour, 24 loaves of rye on the floor with boot prints stamped into them. Then he crouched down and picked up something small from under the counter. It was a roll, cold, untouched, shaped badly by hands that were too small to shape things well, into something with 2 little wings and a beak. Nora, standing in the doorway of her ruined home, said, "That's a patak. It's a bird. Mama lets me make one on Thursdays." Matteo Vitale, who had not cried at his brother's funeral or his wife's, stood in the middle of a bakery on Iron Row, holding a bread roll shaped like a bird. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He kept it for 24 years. Anna Kowalski was on the table for 6 hours. Iris Novak did not lose her, though there were 2 separate moments where a lesser surgeon would have. There was a bleed under the skull that had to come out, and there was a wrist that had to be rebuilt with pins. And there was, at 4 in the morning, a moment where the anesthesiologist looked at Novak over his mask, and Novak said, very quietly, that they were not stopping. Down the hall, in a plastic chair meant for one adult, a 6-year-old girl slept sideways across the lap of the most feared man in South Philadelphia. Nurses walked past. They looked. They kept walking. He didn't move for 4 hours, not once. There's a nurse named Deborah Ruiz who told this story until the day she retired, that at one point in the middle of the night, she came by with a cup of coffee for him, and he shook his head, because taking it would have meant lifting his arm, and the child was asleep on his arm. At 5 in the morning, Iris Novak came out with her mask around her neck and blood dried in the creases of her knuckles. "She'll live," Novak said. "I don't know what she'll be. The next 4 days will tell us. She may not know her own name." Matteo nodded. "Will she know her daughter?" "I don't know," Novak said. He absorbed that. "There's an account at Provident," he said. "There's going to be money in it by 9 o'clock. Whatever it costs. She never sees a bill, she never hears a number, and if anybody in this building tries to move her to a ward, I want you to call me first." Matteo. Iris Novak was maybe the only person in Philadelphia who used his first name to his face. She was looking at the little girl asleep on his arm. What happens now? And this is where the story turns. Because every man who worked for Matteo Vitale had spent the last 8 hours assuming they knew exactly what happened now. There was a warehouse on Swanson Street. There was a stretch of the Delaware River where the current does something useful. Ray Quinn and Dutch Malloy were going to disappear. And by Saturday, there'd be a story going around, and everyone on Iron Row would understand it. And that would be that. That's how these stories go. That's how every story like this goes. It's how the story went in the version you've heard 100 times. Matteo Vitale looked at Iris Novak and said, "Now I ask the mother." Ray Quinn woke up because someone was standing at the foot of his bed, not touching him, just standing there in the dark of a rented room on Amber Street with the door closed behind him and the streetlight coming through the blind in stripes. Bear Pastore said, "Get dressed, coat too, it's cold." Quinn went for the drawer. Bear let him get it open. Then Bear closed it, with Quinn's hand still in it, and held it closed, and waited. And after a while, Quinn stopped screaming and got dressed. They took Dutch Malloy out of a girlfriend's apartment on Berks. He came easier. He asked 3 times where they were going and got no answer. And by the time they turned onto Ridge Avenue, he had figured it out and had gone the color of old paper. The bakery had lights on inside. That was the thing that broke him, Bear said later. Not the men, not the cars, the lights. Somebody had swept the glass. Somebody had put a sheet of plywood over the front window, and there was a bare bulb hanging in there, and the door was open, and it was warm inside. And the 2 men who had put a woman through a display case 8 hours earlier were walked back into that warmth by the elbow. Matteo Vitale sat on a stool by the flour bins. He didn't stand up. He had a cup of tea in front of him, and he was reading, of all things, the order book. A spiral notebook, where Anna Kowalski wrote what she owed and what she was owed in tiny slanted handwriting, half Polish, half English. He let them stand there for 4 full minutes. Then he said, $31. Neither of them spoke. She offered you $31 and a tray of rye. It's in the book. She wrote it down before you came because she wrote everything down. He turned the notebook around so they could see the page, though they were 9 feet away and couldn't read a word. There's an entry here from November. Somebody named Adler at the pharmacy. She gave him bread for 8 weeks and never charged him because his wife was sick. It's marked Niye Ma, nothing owed. You know what that means? It means she carried him. Dutch Malloy started to say something about how it wasn't personal, how it was just the collection, how Deacon set the number. Mateo raised one finger and Dutch Malloy stopped talking. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it exactly, Mateo said. There are men in this city who would tell you I'm a bad man, and they'd have a case. I've done things. Some of them I'd do again. But there was always a line, and the line was this. Everybody at this table chose to sit down at it. Everybody in my business volunteered. You understand? A man who takes money from me and lies to me about it, he knew the terms. He signed up. A woman selling bread at 6 in the morning did not sign up. A child in her socks did not sign up. He closed the order book. You want to know what makes you different from me? You'll tell yourself it's that I'm rich and you're not, or that I'm old and you're young, or that I've got 20 guys and you've got a bat. That's not it. He tapped the counter. It's that when I was your age, I would have known in my body that this room was off limits. Nobody had to teach me. You two walked in here and looked at a woman with flour on her hands and a kid upstairs, and you saw a number. Ray Quinn, the one with the burn scar, was crying by then. He'd been crying since the door. Kill us then, he said. And Matteo Vitale looked genuinely tired. That would be easy, he said. You'd be dead in an hour, and nothing on this street would change. The next Deacon Pyle would send the next 2 of you, and everybody on Iron Row would keep the lights off and lock the door when a little girl knocks. That's what you people don't understand about killing. It's cheap. It fixes nothing. It's the lazy man's answer, and half this city runs on it. He stood up, slowly. Old knees. No, he said. I'm not going to decide what happens to you. He nodded toward the door. She is. It took 9 days. Anna Kowalski woke up on the 3rd day and didn't know where she was. On the 4th day, she knew her own name. On the 6th day, her daughter walked into that room, and Anna Kowalski said, Nora, and the whole floor of that hospital heard the sound that came out of that woman, and 2 nurses had to leave. On the 9th day, a man in a gray overcoat came and sat in the chair by the bed and told her, plainly and without decorating any of it, who he was, what her daughter had done, and what he was proposing. He'd found the 2 men. He had them. They were in a room on Swanson Street, and they had been there for 9 days, and they weren't going anywhere until she said so. Anna Kowalski, with one eye swollen shut and a wrist full of steel pins, listened to all of it. Then she asked him the question nobody expected. Are they poor? Matteo Vitale said afterward that in 50 years of sitting across tables from people, no one had ever knocked him back on his heels the way that woman did with 3 words. Yes, he said. They're poor. She was quiet for a while, and then she said, in her accent, slowly, choosing the English carefully because she wanted no misunderstanding. When my Tomasz died, I had a store and no money. Now I have no store and no money. If you kill them, I still have no store. She looked at him with her one good eye. Make them build it back. There was a silence in that hospital room. Say that again, said Matteo Vitale. They broke my window. They broke my case. They broke my oven bricks. Let them fix it, with hands. And when it is fixed, let them work. 4 o'clock in the morning, when the dough is proofed, that is when a baker works. Let them come every day at 4 o'clock for 1 year, and let them learn what it costs to make $80. She turned her face to the wall. And I don't want their money, she said. Money I would spend. This they will remember. Bear Pastore was standing in the doorway. He said the boss sat there for a good 10 seconds without saying anything at all. Then, Matteo Vitale started to laugh. Not cruelly. It was a low, disbelieving, almost grateful laugh. The laugh of a man who has been in the wrong business for 40 years and has just been shown, by a bankrupt widow with a fractured skull, an idea that had never once occurred to him. Signora, he said, you are more frightening than I am. Now. The 2 men who swung the bat were never the problem, and Matteo Vitale knew it before he ever sat down on that stool. Deacon Pyle was 34. He wore a camel coat and a gold cross outside his shirt. He'd never hit anybody in his life. He had a bookkeeper. He had a lawyer. He gave $200 a month to a church on Poplar and sat in the third pew every Sunday where people could see him do it. And he had, over 18 months, quietly turned 9 blocks of small shops into a machine that took $80 a month out of people who did not have $80 a month. They met on a Tuesday in the church because Pyle chose the church. He thought it was clever. He thought Matteo Vitale was an old Italian who would be embarrassed to do anything under a crucifix. Matteo came alone. He sat down in the third pew next to Deacon Pyle, and he didn't say anything for a while. And Pyle, who was young, filled the silence, the way young men do. He talked about respect. He talked about how Iron Row had been open territory. He offered a percentage. Then he made his mistake. He said, "Look, some old lady got roughed up. My guys got carried away. Things happen." Matteo Vitale turned his head and looked at him. "Her name is Anna," he said. "Her daughter's name is Nora. The dead husband's name was Tomasz. Say them." Pyle laughed. He actually laughed. That laugh cost him everything he had. Here's what Matteo Vitale did, and pay attention, because this is why the man died, old and in his own bed. He didn't touch Deacon Pyle. Not that week, not ever. He bought his paper. Pyle was leveraged. Men like him always are, because the coat and the car and the cross come first, and the arithmetic comes never. He owed a Shylock on 4th Street $11,000. He owed his own supplier $6,000. He had a car note and a girlfriend in an apartment he didn't own. Within 19 days, quietly, through 3 intermediaries and a lawyer named Feld, who had been sitting in Belandi's on the night the door opened, every dollar of Deacon Pyle's debt belonged to Matteo Vitale. Every dollar. And then he simply called it in. All at once, legally, on paper, with signatures. The cars went, the apartment went. The bookkeeper, who was a practical man, went to work for somebody else, and Deacon Pyle stood in an empty room on a Thursday with nothing but a camel coat and a gold cross, and there was a knock at the door, and it was Bear Pastora, and Bear handed him a paper bag. Inside the bag was $11,000, and a list. 41 names, every shop, every family, every person on Iron Row who had paid Deacon Pyle $1 in 18 months, and beside each name, the exact amount. Because Anna Kowalski was not the only person on that street who wrote things down. Bear said, "You walk it back, door to door. You knock, you hand it over, and you say your name and what you did. 41 doors. He'll know if you skip one." Pyle said, "And if I don't?" Bear said, "Then you keep the money and you leave Philadelphia tonight and you never come back. And I want you to think very hard about which of those 2 things you're actually capable of doing." Deacon Pyle knocked on 41 doors. It took him 6 days. On the 11th door, a man spat on him. On the 22nd, a woman took the money and closed the door without a word. On the 34th, an old man named Adler at the pharmacy, the one who'd walked into the back room when a 6-year-old was banging on his glass, took the envelope and stood there holding it and could not look Deacon Pyle in the face because both of them knew exactly what the other one was. Pyle left the city that spring. Nobody knows where. The Iron Row crew dissolved in under a month. That's what happens to a thing like that, when the money stops and the fear stops and the name stops meaning anything. It doesn't get destroyed, it just evaporates. I said at the start that people on Iron Row still argue about this story, so let me give you the argument. Ray Quinn and Dutch Malloy showed up at that bakery at 4 o'clock in the morning on a Wednesday in March of 1974. They rebuilt the window. They relaid the oven brick badly, then tore it out and did it again, because Anna Kowalski stood there with her arm in a cast and told them it was wrong. They hauled 50-pound flour sacks up from a cellar with a bad stare. They scrubbed a floor with steel wool on their knees. And every single morning of that year, the woman whose skull they had fractured stood 8 feet away from them and gave them instructions and never once raised her voice and never once said thank you. Dutch Malloy quit after 7 months. He got on a bus. Nobody stopped him. That was allowed. That was, in fact, the whole point. Ray Quinn stayed. He stayed the full year. And on the last day when the debt was finished and the door was open and he could have walked out of it, he stood in that bakery with his hat in his hands and asked Anna Kowalski if he could keep coming. She said no. She said no for 4 months. He came anyway at 4 in the morning and stood outside on the sidewalk until she opened, and then he'd walk away. In August of 1975, she let him back in. Now here's where people get angry with me for telling it this way. Ray Quinn worked at Kowalski's for 31 years. He never married. He never touched a drink after 1974. He ran the ovens, and eventually he ran the shop when Anna's hands got bad. And when Anna Kowalski died in 2004, he was one of the men who carried her. And there are people, good people, who will tell you that is a beautiful thing. And there are people on that street whose grandmothers knew Anna, who will tell you to this day that the man who put her through a display case should never have been allowed to hold her coffin, and that forgiveness handed out by one person doesn't cover the debt owed to everybody else. I don't think there's a clean answer. I've thought about it a lot. I don't think Anna Kowalski forgave him, honestly. I think she did something colder and stranger than forgiveness. I think she took a man who had made her into an object, and she spent 31 years making him watch, at 4 o'clock every morning, exactly what she was. Matteo Vitale kept coming to that bakery on Thursdays. Not as a boss. He never took $1 off that street. Enzo Ferro made sure everyone understood that Iron Row was closed, permanently to everybody, including them. And it stayed closed. He'd come in around 7, buy a rye and a coffee, and sit at the little table by the window while a girl did her homework across from him. He helped her with arithmetic. He was terrible at spelling, and she was better, and she'd correct him, and he would take it from her and from nobody else on earth. He came for 24 years. He was at her high school graduation in 1986, in the back, in the gray coat. He paid for her first 2 years of nursing school, and she found out about it in 1991, and they had a fight about it that Anna refused to referee. Matteo Vitale died in November of 1998. He was 85. He died at home in his own bed, which almost nobody in his profession does. Nora Kowalski was 30 years old and a surgical nurse at the same hospital where Iris Novak had once opened her mother's skull, and she was holding his hand when he went. They found something in the inside pocket of his jacket, in the closet, in a small tin box with a lid. It was hard as a stone by then, 24 years old, gray, cracked, weightless. A bread roll shaped badly, by hands too small to shape things well, with 2 little wings and a beak. He'd carried it to a cemetery in Yeyadon every February for 24 years and brought it back home again. We tell this story wrong. Everybody tells it wrong, including, for the last 40 minutes, me. We tell it as the story of a little girl who found the most dangerous man in Philadelphia and got him to save her mother. But sit with it for a second. Anna Kowalski was saved by a surgeon named Iris Novak, who did not need Matteo Vitale to be a good person, only to owe her a favor. The men who hurt her weren't punished by a mob boss. They were sentenced by their victim to a year of 4 a.m. labor, which is not a thing any mafia boss on this earth would ever have invented. Deacon Pyle wasn't destroyed by violence. He was destroyed by a ledger. And every one of those things happened because a 6-year-old girl in wet socks made an accurate assessment of a room full of frightened adults and walked past all of them and knocked on the one door in South Philadelphia that would open. The people behind the lit windows on Iron Row didn't help her because they were afraid. The man in the restaurant helped her because 20 years earlier, he had sat in a prison cell 3 miles from a hospital while his own daughter died, and nobody opened the door for him either. That's the whole story. That's all it ever was. 2 people who had learned the same lesson from opposite ends of it, meeting in a doorway on a Thursday night in February. Nora Kowalski still runs the bakery. It's still there. The window's been replaced twice more since. Every Thursday she makes 1 roll shaped like a bird, and she doesn't sell it. And if you go in on a Thursday and ask her about it, she'll tell you it's for a friend. And if you really ask her, why a 6-year-old walked into a room full of gangsters instead of running to a police station 4 blocks closer, she'll give you the same answer she gave a reporter in 2009. She'll say, "Because I wasn't looking for a good man. I was looking for somebody who would come. Sometimes the smallest hand in the room is the only one willing to reach out." If this story got to you the way it gets to me, do 3 things. Hit the like button because it genuinely helps. Subscribe because there are more of these coming and you don't want to miss them. And drop a comment telling me, was Anna Kowalski right? Should Ray Quinn have been allowed to stay? I read every one of them. I'm still not sure what I think. Thanks for watching.